In 1864, while America was tearing itself apart, a secret so dangerous it meant instant death was hidden in plain sight. Not by an adult, not by a soldier, but by a child who was enslaved. For 9 straight months, this child secretly hid a wounded runaway slave, feeding him, protecting him, and risking everything, while slave catchers searched just feet away. One mistake, one sound, and both lives would have ended on the spot. But when the truth was finally discovered, what happened next shocked everyone, including the people who thought they held all the power. If stories like this matter to you, stories history tried to bury, subscribe now so you don't miss the ones they never taught in school. And before we begin, comment below where you're watching from, your country, your city, or your state. Now, let me tell you how a forgotten child changed history in 1864. The pistol shots that rang out across the Virginia plantation in October 1864 shattered what had been, for 9 months, an almost improbable silence. They came without warning. They came with the weight of judgment already rendered. And in those moments between the first crack of gunfire and the screams that followed, an act of defiance, carried out by hands too small to hold a weapon, by a mind too young to fully understand the consequences, was about to explode into the consciousness of everyone within earshot. This is the story of how a child, bound by the same chains that held her enslaver's property, risked everything to harbor another human being marked for death. It is a story that historians have struggled to preserve, not because it lacks drama or moral clarity, but because it challenges every assumption we hold about who the architects of resistance were and what courage truly looks like when it wears a child's face. The plantation where this happened was called Riverside, though the river that gave it its name ran dark and cold, indifferent to the human suffering that lined its banks. The owner was a man named Thaddeus Whitmore, a man of considerable wealth, negligible conscience, and the particular brand of entitlement that made him believe his ownership extended not just to the bodies of his enslaved people, but to every moment of their lives, every breath they drew, every secret they kept. He had no idea that one of his secrets was already living in plain sight. Her name was Sarah. She was 11 years old when a man named Thomas stumbled onto the plantation in the darkness of a winter night, his left leg nearly destroyed by the gunshot wound he had received when he attempted to escape 3 weeks earlier. He had made it perhaps 5 miles from his previous master's property when the dogs caught him. The rifle fire that followed was meant to kill him. It nearly did. Thomas was 23. He had spent every waking moment of his adult life owned by a man who had beaten him unconscious on 3 separate occasions. When he heard that, he was about to be sold downriver, a sentence that in those days was understood to be a death sentence of a different, slower kind. Something in him decided that dying while running was preferable to dying while kneeling. So he ran. The bullet that caught him in the thigh was followed by another that grazed his ribs. He fell into a creek bed, and by the grace of whatever forces govern the line between survival and extinction, the dogs lost his scent in the water. He pulled himself out on the opposite bank and continued moving, though moving became less of a forward motion and more of a desperate crawl. He would have died on the road if Sarah had not found him. She had wandered away from her quarters that night because she was 11 years old, and the weight of confinement was already becoming unbearable. She had been enslaved her entire life naturally. She had never known freedom, but she had also never stopped understanding, in some fundamental way that children grasp before adults teach them to ignore it, that what was happening to her and everyone around her was wrong. When she stumbled across Thomas bleeding into the mud not far from the eastern border of the plantation, she did not scream. She did not run to fetch the overseer. She did something far more dangerous. She made a decision. She brought him water first. Then she brought him cloth torn from her own bedding. She did not ask him his name or where he came from, or whether her father, the overseer of Riverside One, would have her whipped within an inch of her life for helping him. She simply decided, in that way that children sometimes do, to act from a place of absolute certainty. "You have to be quiet," she told him. "No one can know." And for 9 months, no one did. The space where Thomas lived was perhaps 10 feet by 8 feet, hidden behind the root cellar beneath the main kitchen building. Sarah had discovered it years earlier while playing, a forgotten cavity in the plantation's infrastructure, likely created by poor construction or the settling of foundation stones. To reach it required descending into the kitchen cellar, moving aside a wooden barrel that had been empty for months, and squeezing through an opening that looked, to anyone passing by, like nothing more than a gap in the wall caused by time and neglect. Sarah cleaned that space first. She did this at night when the plantation slept, carrying debris out in handfuls and burying it far from the structures where anyone might find it. She dragged in an old crate to serve as a bed. She found a blanket so worn and threadbare that no one would miss it, and created something that might have been mistaken for comfort if you did not know what comfort actually was. For 9 months, she was the sole link between Thomas and the world above him. She was the chain that held him to survival. Every morning, she worked in the plantation kitchen alongside the cook, a woman named Lucia who had long ago learned the art of seeing nothing when the consequences of seeing something were too heavy to bear. Sarah would wrap food in cloth, biscuits, portions of whatever stew or vegetable had been prepared for the enslaved workers, and hide it in the folds of her skirt. During her brief moments away from watchful eyes, she would descend into the cellar and place the food just inside the opening to that hidden chamber. She never looked at Thomas directly. She had learned that lesson from the world around her. The most dangerous connections are the ones people can see. Water was harder. The well was far from the kitchen, and water left marks, created trails that could be followed. She learned to scatter her trips across days and times, never establishing a pattern. She would dip the bucket seemingly at random, sometimes at dawn, sometimes in the heat of afternoon, sometimes when she had no apparent reason to be near the well at all. She developed small vessels she could conceal, containers made from old gourds she had hollowed out, and filled them and hid them beneath her skirts as if she were carrying contraband far more precious than water. Because it was. Thomas emerged from that cellar only once during those 9 months. His leg had become infected. The wound, which Sarah had tended as best she could with the limited knowledge of an 11-year-old girl, had turned a color that frightened her in ways she could not articulate. She could not read, but she had observed enough of human suffering to know that colors like that meant death was negotiating terms. Lucia, the kitchen cook, discovered what was happening not through carelessness, but through compassion. She found Sarah crying one morning after the girl had completed her work, and something in the configuration of that grief told Lucia everything she needed to know. Lucia had already sensed that something extraordinary was occurring on the plantation. She had noticed Sarah's strange patterns, her careful extractions of food, the particular intensity with which she occupied her days. Instead of raising an alarm, Lucia did something that would have been incomprehensible to Thaddeus Whitmore had he known of it. She helped. She possessed a knowledge of herbs and roots, the kind of knowledge that enslaved people had accumulated across generations, desperately gathering understanding in a world designed to grant them none. She created poultices from plant matter that grew wild beyond the plantation's cultivated fields. She instructed Sarah in their preparation. She arranged it so that her own work near the root cellar would occasionally coincide with moments when Sarah needed to be there, creating cover for the girl's movements, establishing patterns of normalcy around actions that were anything but normal. Together, Sarah and Lucia became something more significant than they had been individually. They became a conspiracy of care in a world built entirely on commodification and cruelty. Thomas survived. The infection receded. His leg, which would never again function properly, began to heal in ways that suggested regeneration rather than mere scar tissue formation. And through it all, Sarah, now 12 years old, continued her routines with the mechanical precision of someone who had already learned that discovery meant not just her own suffering, but the execution of the man she was protecting. 9 months is 274 days. It is more than 6,000 hours. It is countless moments during which someone could have noticed something amiss. A discrepancy in the food stores, a pattern in Sarah's movements, a sound from beneath the cellar, the simple physics of water that disappears without explanation. On a plantation, observation is the primary currency of control. Overseers, drivers, and enslaved people positioned in hierarchy slightly above others are trained to notice everything. Eyes are always watching. Reports are always being filed, mentally if not on paper. The structure of enslavement depends on absolute surveillance, on the understanding that any deviation, any secret, is a threat to the entire apparatus. Yet Sarah had managed to keep one of the largest secrets possible. She had managed to maintain a lie so complete that it had never even been suspected enough to be investigated. How had she done this? The answer lies not in luck, though luck certainly played a role, but in her understanding of the world around her at a level that suggests she had absorbed lessons about survival that no child should ever need to learn. She understood that the best way to hide something is not to hide it at all, but to make it invisible through ordinariness. Her desperation was her camouflage. Her suffering was her protection. An enslaved child working in a plantation kitchen is expected to work. An enslaved child moving between locations is expected to move. An enslaved child showing signs of exhaustion and careworn bearing is expected to show such signs because the entire system is predicated on exhaustion and the wearing away of human capacity. Sarah did not stand out because standing out would have meant deviation from an already established baseline of acceptable oppression. But there was one thing she could not account for, one variable that existed beyond the careful architecture of her concealment. The war was ending. By October 1864, everyone could feel it, though no one could articulate precisely how or when it would arrive. The Confederate States were fracturing, Union armies were advancing. The economic and military certainty that had sustained the institution of slavery for generations was becoming increasingly fragile. And in that fragility, men like Thaddeus Whitmore became more volatile, more prone to sudden decisions, more likely to act on impulse rather than pattern. It was this fragility that would ultimately unravel everything. The overseer who found Thomas was a man named Garrett Pierce, a man whose cruelty was not the product of ideological conviction but of simple preference. He preferred dominance to fairness, violence to dialogue, control to anything resembling mutual understanding. He had worked for Whitmore for 7 years, and in that time he had developed a particular way of moving through the plantation, always appearing where he was least expected, always asking questions that seemed to come from nowhere, always testing the boundaries of people's composure. On an ordinary morning in October, he descended into the root cellar for reasons that historians have never fully determined. Some accounts suggest he was searching for something specific, preserved goods that had gone missing. Other accounts suggest he was simply following one of his unpredictable inspection routes. What is certain is that he entered that cellar, moved the barrel, and discovered the opening. What is also certain is that he found Thomas. The first alert came not from the cellar itself, but from the sound that Garrett Pierce made when he returned to the surface. A sound described by those who heard it as something between a shout and a laugh, a noise that contained the kind of excitement that precedes violence. Sarah knew immediately there was no moment of confusion, no instant of disorientation. The moment she heard that sound, she understood that the 9 months were over. Everything she had done, every risk she had taken, every moment she had bought for Thomas with her own small hands, all of it had reached the moment of reckoning. Whitmore was summoned from his office. What followed was a series of decisions made in rapid succession, the kind of decisions that men drunk on power and fear make when they perceive a threat. The plantation descended into a kind of mobilized chaos. Enslaved people were ordered to gather in the courtyard. The root cellar was sealed. And Thomas, pulled from his hiding place like something being extracted from a grave, was brought before his owner and the assembled crowd. What happened next depended on who was telling the story. According to Whitmore's own accounting, which survives in letters he wrote to Confederate authorities, Thomas was identified as a fugitive slave belonging to a plantation 2 counties over. He was a criminal and a thief by definition, guilty of theft of labor and time. His capture was a victory, he argued, a restoration of order in a world threatened by chaos. He had already arranged for Thomas to be transported back to his original master, though the condition Thomas would arrive in was left unspecified in Whitmore's correspondence. But before that could happen, another decision had to be made. A decision about Sarah. The historical records at this point become fragmented. What we know is this. Whitmore learned that Sarah, his own enslaved property, had been harboring a fugitive. He learned that she had been stealing food, wasting water, and maintaining a deception that had operated under his nose for nearly a year. He learned that she had done all of this while occupying a position within his own household, while working in his kitchen, while living as one of his possessions. The response was immediate and severe. An enslaved child who had committed such an act, a child who had actively resisted the authority and order of the plantation, who had demonstrated that she could think and plan and execute a plan that contradicted the absolute will of her owner, represented something that terrified men like Thaddeus Whitmore far more than an escaped slave ever could. She represented the possibility of agency among those who were supposed to be incapable of it. Lucia, the cook who had helped, was also discovered. Her role in the concealment became the subject of interrogation, though the specific details of that interrogation are lost to history. preserved only in fragments and references in documents that themselves seem designed to obscure rather than reveal. What happened next is where the historical record becomes most troubling and most contested. Different accounts exist. Different records were kept. Some sources suggest that Sarah was severely beaten and then sold away from the plantation immediately. Other sources suggest that she was executed. Still, other sources are silent on the question of what ultimately became of her, and that silence itself is perhaps the most damning piece of evidence we possess. Lucia's fate is similarly obscured by the mists of incomplete documentation. One thing is certain: she was no longer employed at the plantation by the end of 1864. Thomas, the man at the center of this entire history, was returned to his original master and disappeared into the machinery of slavery in its final months. Whether he survived to see the war's end, whether he ever learned what had happened to the girl who had saved his life, remains unknown. History has not preserved his fate in any surviving documents. What we are left with, then, is a story of incomplete knowledge, of missing endings, of historical silences that refuse to be filled despite our desire to understand how it resolved. This is not unusual. Most acts of resistance during slavery, most moments of defiance, most instances of human beings choosing compassion over complicity were never officially recorded. They exist in the margins of history, in family stories passed down through generations, in oral traditions that are themselves fragile and vulnerable to loss. But the very fact that this story survived at all tells us something crucial. It survived because multiple people understood that it needed to be remembered. It survived because someone, decades after the events themselves, decided to write down what they had been told, to preserve something of what had transpired on that plantation in 1864. Sarah was 11 years old when she made a choice. She was 12 when the world discovered what she had done. The full arc of her life, her experiences before and after, remains largely inaccessible to us. We do not know if she lived to see freedom. We do not know if she ever felt safe again. We do not know what resources she possessed to process the trauma of having been instrumental in the protection of another human being, only to watch that protection shattered. What we do know is this: in a moment of profound moral clarity, a child understood that the rights claimed over her could not legitimately extend to her conscience. She understood that she could refuse, that resistance was possible even for those with the fewest resources and the least power. She understood that the most powerful institution in the antebellum South, the institution of slavery itself, could be contradicted by the actions of a girl in a kitchen, moving quietly through darkness, carrying water. The 9 months that Thomas lived in that cellar were bought with Sarah's courage and Lucia's defiance. They were paid for in the currency of risk and sacrificed innocence, and the willingness to accept consequences that no one should ever have to face. On October 1864, when the pistol shots were fired and the discovery was made, those 9 months came to an end. But the story, the incredible, terrible, vital story of what had transpired, had already written itself into history. It had already become something that could not be erased, something that would demand to be remembered and reckoned with by anyone who truly wanted to understand what slavery was and what it meant to resist it. This is what the historical record preserves in its fragmented and incomplete way. Not answers, but questions. Not conclusions, but the opening of doors into the consciousness of people we will never fully know. In a time we can only approach with humility and the recognition that our understanding will always be partial, always incomplete, and all the more important for being so. The gunshots of October 1864 ended one chapter. But the story they concluded had already changed everything it touched.